welcome everyone to the Dynamics Compass podcast, where insights from experts will help Dynamics partners and users navigate their way through the rapidly evolving ecosystem. Today, we're joined by Alex Meyer. Alex has been a Microsoft BizApps MVP since 2019. His expertise spans from Dynamics 365, both Azure, both finance and operations and Business Central, as well as the Power Platform. Alex's proficiency extends to the Azure suite, including Azure AD, Azure DevOps, and the Azure portal. In his current role, Alex serves as a pivotal technical resource and a subject matter expert on Microsoft Cloud security, auditing, and compliance. And his passion for knowledge sharing is evident through his active engagement in creating thought leadership material, whether it's presenting at conferences, conducting webinars, authoring books, white papers, blog posts, or hosting podcasts. Alex is dedicated to enlightening the public on these critical topics. And all of this, in my opinion, makes him the perfect person to tackle today's Copilot topic, namely security and privacy. Alex, thanks so much for joining and tackling these topics today.
Yeah, thanks, Rory, and thanks for having me today.
Yeah, you're welcome. So for the people that haven't seen any of the previous videos, we've been asking around a lot, like what are the main topics that people are asking when they're going through their journey, their Copilot journey, whether they should determine like, are we ready for this, or what are the risks before they want to pull the trigger, or right after they pull the trigger. And the biggest topic by far has been data security and privacy. So I'll kick off with the first question, Alex. The most popular one that we got: is my data stored where other organizations might accidentally access it, like what happened with Samsung in the early ChatGPT days?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and especially one when you're coming in from a business side, right? That you have to take into account, right? It's one thing to use this on a personal basis, right, to ask questions, and it's another thing when you start getting business data involved. So one of the big things to always keep in mind when you're looking at this is that there's the public side of this, right, and then there's the more business focused side. And so Copilot is using the same background technology in the sense that, it's using large language models to help train it and things like that. But how those models are trained and what data it has access to is going to differ whether you're using the public facing OpenAI, for example, right? Or if you're using something like the Azure AI or OpenAI service, right? So really, when you get down to it, right, your Copilot instance is going to really be for your particular tenant, right, is really in the guardrails of that tenant, right? So you have the large language model backing behind everything, right? But when you start getting your specific data for your organization, right, it's only going to live within your Azure tenant or M365 environment, right? And so that's something that, it's not making requests out to, OpenAI like your ChatGPT is, right, or any other AI tool. It's going to be sandboxed, right, if you want to think of it that way, right, within your tenant. So, that's step one. And then the other thing to kind of keep in mind, or things to keep in mind here, right, is that, because Copilot is built on top of Azure, you get a lot of those goodies, right, that Azure has built in. So for example, Copilot is going to encrypt data in transit and in rest, right? So anything that you send to Copilot or anything that it's gathering and sending back to you, right, is always going to be encrypted and transmitted in a secure fashion. And then, like we were talking about, there's that logical isolation of customers, right? Because, customer A has their tenant and, everything is housed in there. Right. If you go to customer B, it's still running on the Azure service, right, behind the scenes, but that's completely separated from a logistic, isolation perspective. And so that same methodology, right, comes forward when you're talking about, Microsoft Copilot and the business case of that.
Yeah, I'm assuming most people will know, but just in case we have someone watching this, what's a tenant?
Yeah, so a tenant is basically the collection. If you look at it from like an Azure perspective, it's a collection of resources that your organization has, and it's a way to kind of group all of those together, right? So your Azure tenant, for example, might be, if you're using like the Microsoft demo data, Contoso, right? So it'd be if you have something at contoso.com, right? When you log into like Azure, you're going to log in as, Bob Smith at contoso.com, and that at contoso.com is going to tell Microsoft which tenant, right, you have access to. So all of your Azure resources then would be under your quote unquote Contoso tenant, if you want to look at it that way. So it's just the grouping of objects that your organization has access to, whether that's in Outlook or SharePoint or Azure, right? All of those are going to fall under that quote unquote tenant. Then you can set your security right within that tenant to what users have access to what.
Yeah. All right. That makes sense. So you were already going in this direction. But just to clarify with this question, is my data being used to train the model for Copilot?
Yeah. So another key difference here is that Copilot, if you're using the public-facing ChatGPT, right, or OpenAI, all of your interactions are influencing the model in some way, shape, or form. Some are influencing more than others, right? But in this case, the interactions with the service itself are not going to be used to train, and that's very specific to train the model. That's very specific design principles that Microsoft is following because they don't want that unintended leakage, right, of customer influence on the large language model itself. So really, again, because your Copilot, again, the backing of it is all, the large language models that Microsoft has, and those can update. But when you start applying the interactions that your employees have or your data into Copilot, right, that's going to be contained within your tenant again, right? If we go back to that concept of and in isolating that piece off from anybody else's Copilot, right?
Yeah, that's good because those are that was one of the biggest topics that have come up when I was speaking to people like, oh, is my everything I put in my prompts, will it be used to train a model? And it's very good to get that clarified today.
Right.
Another example, I've been speaking to people that are, for example, in Canada, and they're considering to play around or to adopt Copilot. But they've been told the Copilot tenants for Microsoft are either in the US or in Europe. What is the risk of sending their data or their prompts across borders?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Especially when you start getting into the audit or the regulatory requirements, right? Especially if you look at things like GDPR or HIPAA in the US or CCPA or any of these where you have your data custodian, right? Then you have to make sure that you are not negatively impacting a customer by sending their data outside of a particular region, right? And so part of this is that Microsoft is slowly enabling Copilot in more and more of their quote unquote tenants. And when they say tenants, I think they're more referring to the data centers and things like that, right? Or where you could pass over logistical or geographical bounds, right? When you're starting to connect. And so I do think that there's definitely places where not just from Canada, but from anywhere, right? They have to, that's not natively supported, that you have to be kind of careful about, am I okay with potentially my data going out to a service that's hosted somewhere else? But again, that one thing to keep in mind again is that you have this idea of your local organization tenant, right? And the data from your Copilot is not going to go outside of it. Now it may go across geographical bounds, right? But logistically, your data is still within your quote unquote tenant and should not be able to be accessed by anybody else. But the kind of wrinkle in that, right, is when you start getting into the regulatory requirements, right? GDPR is very specific on where data can reside, or Germany, for another example, right, is very specific on where that data can reside, or China, right? All of these different areas that may not be natively supported by Copilot, but might be able to use, you can deploy a Copilot service somewhere, right? And you could use it. Yeah. Like you have to be careful, just like you would any other resource that you're deploying, right? You have to be kind of careful about where you're deploying your Copilot resources, and how that is going to be utilized in your organization to where that data could potentially end up or reside, even though it's still contained in your tenant, right? Where geographically, right, that data could potentially go.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm drawing the wrong conclusion, but it sounds like there's the word tenant is used in different scenarios. You're talking, there's the tenant from the customer side, where it's their environment they play around with, but Microsoft also calls it the tenant that has the Copilot model, which is like a black box where the prompts go in and it spits out the result. But that's also called a tenant. So whoever's watching needs to be aware.
Yeah.
There's two
Where that
interpretations.
black box is, right, is kind of from a Copilot perspective, right, is kind of where you kind of want to make sure that you have insight into where that being stored, where is this data going, that type of thing. But yes, you're correct that sometimes you have the multiple ways to use that same phrase, right, within Microsoft. So you got to be a little bit careful.
Yeah. It's funny how Microsoft does that. Next question, which you also touched on already. It's within the tenant environment of the customer, but how do you prevent users from accessing info or data that they shouldn't?
Right. No, yeah, that's a fantastic question too, and probably the one that I get followed up by the one that you initially asked about. How is my data going to be used to train the models? Right. It's how do I prevent users from accessing the info they shouldn't? Right. Because we see these instances across the web, on a daily basis where somebody didn't constrain Copilot well enough, right? And somebody's able to ask, hey, what's the salary of the CEO? Or I think there was an example where somebody was able to, in the US at least, was able to contact a car dealership, right? And they sold them a car for $1 because, they didn't lock down the prompts well enough, right? And they basically said the Copilot should answer in this format. So, those are both, slightly different again from a consumer perspective versus a business side. But really the big thing, and this is actually one that companies probably need to start thinking about is, even Microsoft doesn't recommend implementing Copilot if you don't have your existing access control systems in place. So the biggest thing that Copilot is going to use is your Entra ID RBAC, or role-based access control. So it's going to look at what user groups those users are a part of, what roles they are a part of, right? And then what systems that gives them access to and what access within those systems, right? So that's the main driving force to determining what a user can actually gain access to when they're prompting Copilot, right, for an answer. So really, if everyone is assigned sysadmin or domain admin or elevated privileges in your environment, right, you really can't install or implement Copilot in your environment or in your organization until that's resolved, because otherwise you're opening yourself up to potentially a large, risk profile, right, from that. So one thing I will point out here is that Copilot does contain detailed logs of all user interactions, right? So you can actually go in and see what did the user prompt with, what did they get back, right? So you can do detective work.
That's good for people to know. Whatever prompts they put in, that it gets logged.
Right. And you can see the data that they get back. So if they prompt it for, hey, show me everyone's salary in the organization, right, you can actually see what data they got back, kind of thing. But, that's detective control. And obviously you want to have the preventative side of stopping that beforehand. And so the Microsoft documentation is fairly clear, honestly, about the fact that you want to make sure that you have current existing access controls in place and that you're doing reviews of that access, right? So if anybody's listened to me talk before, right, that's one of the things we always talk about on the business application perspective, right, that you should be looking and reviewing what a user has access to on a periodic basis. The same thing is going to, pertain here as well. Making sure that your users have the access they should, they're not granted too much access, right? And potentially, opening the door for them to gain access to data that they shouldn't have.
Yeah, that makes sense. You kind of answered this question then already, but if a customer doesn't have their access management sorted yet, right, should they start using Copilot already?
Yeah. So I think I'll answer this in two parts, because I think this question, there's two different sides to it. There's the part of access management. And then the other part that people ask about is my data isn't formatted in a very organized format, right? Can I use Copilot?
Yeah.
So we'll start from the access side, right? And again, I think Microsoft is fairly clear on the fact that they don't recommend implementing without having strong access controls, right? And really that gets down to not only, instances of internal, fraud or data leakage or anything like that, but there's also like we touched on before, the regulatory compliance, right? Mm-hmm. GDPR and HIPAA and CCPA, right? If somebody can look up and gets access to data that would break any of those, right? Those are large fines for any organization. And so definitely want to make sure that you're keeping those in check there. And then the easiest and the best way to do that is to make sure that your current role-based access controls are set up correctly. One key thing that I thought it was funny, because during this, I actually was using Copilot to help look up some of these questions and answers and stuff. And Copilot actually recommended or did say that it did have the ability to help clients identify access management issues. So it actually was promoting itself in its answers, which is a true thing. It does have the ability to actually go in and analyze user behavior and look for patterns or flag anomalies or things like that. But again, I wouldn't use that as your main driving force for Copilot, right?
Yeah.
But I thought it was kind of funny that it responded and answered that it could help with that too from that perspective.
Because that does sound then indeed that you could get Copilot at any stage and just ask it to identify all the issues, and you as you go you sort your issues, you close the gaps.
Yeah, I do think it's definitely going to help with the user access. It does. Let's say if you're 80% or 90% of the way there, right, it can help you identify that gap. But if you're wide open right now, I don't know if I could recommend actually implementing it. Mm-hmm. From the other side, with the people come up or I've had people question and be like, my data in our organization's a mess, right? How much help can Copilot give? Yeah. Actually, Copilot does very surprisingly well, depending on the type of data, right? Once it gets too disjointed, it's kind of hard, but it does surprisingly well with kind of hodgepodge of data all over the place to kind of consolidate that and bring it together. So, if you have access controls for the most part figured out, but your data's a mess, right? Copilot does a pretty good job at reasoning over that data. So you have the potential of using it there, but I would still go back to and say from an access management perspective, absolutely like make sure that you have your current access controls, listed out, that they're documented well, that you have your users, in set up in a way that, you aren't guaranteeing them more access than they need, because that's just going to lead to more problems down the line, especially because you're taking the, what a user may unintentionally kind of, find, I have access to this. Now you give them Copilot, which can, greatly enhance their potential, data footprint, if you want to call it that, right? Where they can very easily get access to data without even knowing where that data is stored or that they even had access to it, right? Copilot will return it, right? So it's definitely can be eye-opening at times to see what access and data users have access to.
Yeah. I've also heard of people taking the approach that they know that data management isn't 100% set up yet, but they use Copilot to identify, not that they're asking Copilot identify my quality, but when they notice like, I'm getting bad quality responses here, like, there must be something wrong with my data over there. And that way they know they're not up to scratch with the data management, but Copilot still helps them. Would you recommend that approach though, or would you?
Yeah. That's an interesting take, right? Because the other thing that Copilot will do, right, is it's going to basically give a annotation, right, where it got that data, right? Yeah. So you can actually see the source data of where the responses are coming from. So if you ask it a question and you go, man, this, it got the data from these data sources and it's really not giving me what I want, right? I mean, you basically know that one or more of those data sources, right, is not up to snuff or basically not where Copilot needs it to be for it to actually function correctly. So it gives you a starting point for it. I mean, honestly, there's not I can't think of off the top of my head, a better way to kind of figure that out other than kind of using the system and seeing what kind of returns. So that's absolutely a way to use it to help identify those areas where potentially, right, the data is not in a format that Copilot can ingest, right, in a streamlined fashion.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the recommendation would still be, before you start using Copilot, at least revise what you have and improve as much as possible.
Right. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Alex, thanks so much. Thanks so much for these answers. These all have been questions that I've heard from many partners, from customers. I think this is very informative for a lot of people that are still going through the journey. Because what I've heard as well, even though we've been hearing about Copilot for the last year from all corners, these are the most, or a lot of people are still early on their journey. So I think this is very helpful for a lot of people. So thank you so much. There are a few other topics still. So I'd like to invite you back one day to tackle the other topics. But I wanted to thank you so much for your time today and answering these. And looking forward to chatting with you again.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to come back anytime. Thanks, Rory, and thanks everybody for joining today.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks for watching this episode on the Dynamics Compass podcast. We decided to launch this podcast after having spoken to a lot of people in the community who seem to be looking for answers to the same questions. So then why don't we find experts in the market that have the answers, interview them, and then release that information for free to help everyone progress their Microsoft Dynamics journey. So we hope that you found this video very informative and helpful for you to continue your journey and keep moving forward. If you would like to hear about any other topics, please write to me on LinkedIn, email me, rory@thegoodtalent.co, and we'd be happy to have a look. We'll look for the experts that have the answers. We'll interview them and it will be freely available to you. Again, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for your support as well. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.